This is one of the moderate-sized females, and we can tell an incredible story about when these things, not only were they alive in the seafloor bottom, probably next to their egg cases, they were up to a certain point, and then finally they died. Currents pushed them down so that the right side, in this case, is the upside. And we know that because if you look at the edge of the aperture, it's got this big notch in it coming across here. It's not complete. This should have come up to about there, but instead it's broken back on this side. Every ammonite that we've dug out of the Kremling ammonite site has had this broken side on the upper source. And so what happens is that this female dies, and then all of a sudden, because the living chamber goes from here all the way up to this part, so from here all the way over, was all part of the body. The first thing that happened, of course, is that scavengers would come in and eat the ammonite out of here, leaving it nice and open. When we first saw these breaks on the side, we were thinking that this is very similar to what modern crabs do when they break into shells. And we were thinking initially that this thing was scavenging. But this is a very wide aperture. There's no reason for a scavenger to actually take the time to break that in, especially since they're going to be able to go all the way into the back because these are fairly wide. So there had to be another reason for these. Well, one of the things is that, of course, this thing eventually got filled in with sediment, and the whole part of the ammonite shell is filled with sediment except for the very little end here, which actually is filled with calcium carbonate from groundwater much later. So sediment started moving in here. Well, I got thinking about it, and another thing that's kind of interesting is that sometimes you have a complete aperture in the upper side, but there'll be a big hole back on this side. So one of the things is that possibly that as this thing was being buried, sediment was burying, there's definitely sediment in the area, was burying, it started filling up this part, and maybe an animal was actually breaking this out in order to get access to a nice living place back here. Maybe it's a crack in here, or another thing is that we do know that this hard shell down here was a place in which limpets came in. And there's a limpet hole right here. Limpets will come out and they'll go around and they'll feed, and then they'll come back to the same spot, and then they'll go out and feed, and then they come back to the same spot. And one of the things they do is they put out little acids, and eventually what they can do is actually basically dissolve away the shell, leaving a little round hole. Now, if this was completely filled here, something that wanted to live in here could have chipped away around here, breaking off pieces, making a big enough hole for an entrance and exit. So something may have been actually living in secondarily. What kind of things? Crabs, lobsters, a variety of other things, maybe even some fish. The next thing that we see is, interesting enough, there's lots of little tubes and things of worms that were actually living in the sediment in here. They were coming across, living within there. Again, some of them were feeding, but mostly were probably burrows that they actually lived in within that sediment. There is dissolution on here. We know that these things were in the water. There's little pits here and there within the cell's surface, like some of these things, like in here, in which the shell was actually dissolved. Also, some of the last sutures are also dissolved. We see them come up in the end. What's interesting, the next step is that there was a little bit of compaction, and probably while it was still sediment. And the reason is we get these radial cracks that come around, especially on the outside and usually on the top side, at least in the living chamber like that. They're not often back here where the chambers are, because they're supported by the partitions. But back here, you end up having these cracks with radial, and that's from compressing this thing slightly. So probably what happens, it was filled with sediment, and then it was buried by sediment, and the weight of the overlying sediment compacted the sand in the shell and actually allowed this to break slightly in here. When you look at these cracks, they don't continue into the sediment inside. They're only in the shell itself. Okay, so it means that it probably had loose sediment that was being compacted in here within it. Then the next step on this is that here's this beautiful calcium carbonate shell. It's now buried in sand. Now what happens is groundwaters come in with calcium carbonate. in other words with calcite. And what they do is they're bringing in the calcium ions and the carbonate ions. They come up here, they hit the shell, and what they do is they start cementing both on the inside and the outside. So the inside becomes completely solidified. The outside also does, and so that the actual nodule, it forms a big nodule on the outside. The last thing that we see in this sequence is if you look very carefully in some of these areas, you'll also see the effects of roots. Because when this came up to the surface, grass roots and also sagebrush in some cases comes down and grows down, and there's actually ways of getting in here. And when we first open these up, the shell is usually completely riddled with roots. That's one of the ways that we can pop them out. There's a thin layer of shell here that has been damaged by the roots and very soft, and so when we open up the concretions and pop these out, it allows it, because it breaks along where the shell is. And that's why, like, there's a little bit of shell here, there's a little bit of shell on this side. Most of the shell is gone from this thing because of the effects of root.